So in this video, I want to talk a little bit about debugging in JavaScript. Now, the reason we need debugging is because none of us write perfect code. Problems can always occur, and when problems do occur, it's very important to be able to identify what the problem is so we can fix it quickly. So something that helps us a lot when we're debugging in JavaScript is the console in the browser. So let's head over to index.html, which we have open. Right click, inspect. It might say inspect element on some other browsers. I'm using Chrome. And then this is going to open up. We can see here in the elements, we have the DOM. So we've got our H1 and our linked script down here. Now let's head over to the console because this is where messages about our JavaScript are logged. Now there are two ways that messages are logged there. The first is that they're logged there by the web page, by the browser, because it notices that there's some problem with our JavaScript or it wants to give us a warning. So another way that messages can be logged to the console is if we log them there ourselves, we can log messages to the console throughout our code to check that everything is working properly. So at the moment, you'll see that the console log is empty. Nothing is going wrong with our script. Let's head over to script.js and make a little error in our script. So what I'm going to do is capitalize the second letter of ID. So JavaScript is very case sensitive. It likes camel case here. That means every first letter of each word, apart from the first one, should be capitalized. And if you don't do that, this will create an error. And we can see that error in the console. So let's go back to our page now, refresh, and you'll see that we have a message in the console now. Document.getElementById is not a function, so we know there's a problem with getElementById. And we know it should be camel case, so we can see that that is going to be the problem. And the message also tells us that the problem is on line 4. So the console often provides us with a lot of information that can help us resolve problems very quickly. So going back to our code, line 4. So by creating this error, we created this console log message. Another way that messages appear in the console is if we make them appear in the console. So then say debugging here. And to do that, we call console.log method. And whatever we pass in here is going to be logged in the console. So if I say 2 plus 2, save that and go over to our index.html, it logs 4 to the console. I can also log the contents of things to the console. So for example, I could log this element here. I identify it with getElementById, so I can see what the contents of this element is here. So I'm going to copy and paste that in there, head to the console, and you'll see that the contents of that element is a h1 tag with hello from script.js in it. So at the moment, it may not seem so helpful because we're only dealing with a few lines of code. So to show you a more realistic example, I've prepared some code that we can use. This is an app that displays the time in Sydney, Australia, and it updates every second, so the time ticks. So what I'm going to do is copy and paste that into a new JavaScript file. I'm going to call that time display.js. Okay, copy and paste that. As you can see, Virtual Studio Code isn't telling us that there's any kind of error there. Then I'm going to head over to index.html and I'm going to link to that file. Okay, so I called it time display, so it's in the same directory. I can just locate it like that. And then I'm going to create a container here, just a div element where the time can be displayed. So I'm going to say time display. Okay, so I'm going to save time display. What's going to happen now is the browser is going to run through our HTML document. It's going to execute script.js first. And once it's finished, it's going to execute time display. So the changes we make in script.js will still be there, followed by the time display script being run. Okay, let's head over to the browser now and see if that works. So I refresh the page and there's no time from Australia here where it should be. So I take a look at the console. So I've got the console log from line 8 of script.js, and then I've actually got an error coming up here, and the error has been generated on line 6 of timedisplay.js. Uncaught type error, cannot set properties of null, setting in a text. So this is quite a common error, and what it means is that we're trying to set the inner text of something, but there's no value that we're trying to set it to. It's null. So this has created an error, and it's doing it every second actually because the clock is ticking. So let's head over to our code. The problem is on line 6. So let's look at line 6, time display.inner text equals time, and we created time on the previous line, time.doLocale. Okay, so everything looks kind of good. I can't see the error on line 6 or on the line before it. So this is an example where logging to the console can be really useful because we can log the result of each of the intermediate steps along the way to see where the error is. So I'm going to do that now. It's good practice to do this actually when you're writing the code in the first place, but I just wanted to show you an example where we don't have it and it's actually quite difficult to debug in that case. So we got the element by ID, called it time display, and then inside this function here we set time to the current date, so I can also log that to the console, see if that worked. And then we set the time to local time in Australia, Sydney, Australia. So I log that to the console as well. Okay. And then we can log time display as well. So this is probably built a little bit overkill with the console logs, but what we're doing is logging each individual step so we can try and track the error a little bit better. So let's head over to the browser again and see what's going on. So now when I refresh, we can look at the messages that we've logged to the console, and we can see already on line 2 we've logged something to the console, and it's logged there the value of null. Now we weren't expecting null on line 2, we were expecting the contents of the element that we selected from the page, but we've got null, so there's some sort of problem with the element selection. So let's head back over to our code and see if we can diagnose the problem. So line 2, we're displaying null. So there's something wrong with this code here. So const, that's fine, time display equals document.getElement by ID. So this is proper camel case. And then we've got time display. Okay, so the problem could be here because it all looks good up until this point. So the problem might be that we're not selecting the element properly. So let's have a look. We've got time display here, camel case, index.html, and we're trying to print it to this div here. Now you'll notice here that we've got time-display. In our JavaScript, we've got time display camel case. So we're not actually selecting the element in the first place, and this happens more often than you think. So let's correct that now. And now we can refresh the page and see if that's working. Now, when I refresh, you'll see that we're not getting any error messages in the console, and the time is ticking there as we had hoped. So this is still a rather modest example. There's only 11 lines of code, but in a real project, there could be thousands of lines of code. And I'm sure you can imagine that when code gets that large, it's really, really difficult to identify the problem just by looking at your code. So it's very important to consult the console log of the browser to see if there's any errors. And it's also a good idea to place logs at intermediate steps in your code to check everything's working and identify problems like the one we had in this code. So that is it for this video. In the next video in this series, we are going to be talking about variables.